Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about activity-based costing, and what I'm going to try to do is to reiterate some of the major points that I talked about in the lecture without being too repetitive. First of all, activity-based costing is not a introduction of anything unique that you haven't seen before. You've done it in managerial accounting, you've done it the first few chapters of this book, where you just took the total overhead and divided by some activity, and then applied it in what they call sort of a peanut butter approach, or a one activity based. And again, that creates some problems in terms of overcosting or undercosting. Activity-based costing, on the other hand, is basically taking that total overhead and breaking it into a number of different pools, and then dividing it by a unique activity. So it's not really doing anything different, it's just that you're doing it more times. And as you're doing it more times, but anytime you add or subtract or divide more times, you're always prone to making a few mathematical errors. So separate out that issue from the conceptual one when you're looking at activity-based costing. They're really not the same. Now, the peanut butter approach would be more or less what you would call a simple method. And if you're only manufacturing one product, if you only have one service, then it's fine. You really are not, there's no real need to have to be super complex. Now, as you manufacture more items, if some of them tend to be very simple products versus very complex items, then yes, it probably would be worth your while to look into activity-based costing, because there you would get a better, more accurate allocation of overhead cost. And remember, what we're looking at in this chapter is not the issue of direct costs. Direct materials and direct labor are not the issue in this chapter. The issue in this chapter is what do we do about this thing called overhead. And if you remember that video I showed you of Sappi Paper Mill, overhead can be a huge, huge portion of total cost. So it's behooving to a company to come up with a realistic and very accurate way to measure overhead so that they can get a very accurate measure of the cost to decide, are they making a profit? If we're going to mark it up, what are we going to use as a starting point for marking up a product? As we'll see here in a minute, am I overcosting my product? Am I undercosting my product? Simple methods often hide that. ABC, if you decide to go that way, if the signs are there, can reveal that kind of information. Now, one sort of intermediate variation between the peanut butter approach or the plant-wide approach versus ABC is breaking things into a department. And oftentimes that can be a very acceptable compromise, because many of the costs within a particular department may behave in the same way, and they tend to may be related to a particular activity. So, for example, you could have an assembly plant, you could have a machining plant or department, and again, you could divide one by machine hours, maybe one by labor hours, and that would certainly be a realistic and could be a fairly accurate way of measuring the cost. But again, it would be sort of an intermediate stage between the so-called peanut butter approach versus activity-based costing. And so, for example, if you had Department A, Department B, with their respective overhead, and so if you said, in our example, okay, direct labor hours, if you assume that this Department A is mostly assembly, and let's say in Department B is mostly machining, then yeah, take the cost because they're going to act in the same way, going to have the same characteristics. Labor hours would be a relatively accurate measure of an activity that to apply overhead. And in Department B, which is mostly machines, then yeah, machine hours would be an accurate way of allocating overhead. So you would take it and come up with the application rate of 3750 and 375. Okay, but again, this department method is sort of an intermediate stage. And if you only were manufacturing one or two items that were relatively simple, some of which may require more machining, some of which may require more assembly, it may be a fairly accurate measure. There's no real requirement that you have to make a more complex costing system, so companies are left to decide on their own from a cost-benefit point of view, well, how much time and effort do we want to make in developing an ABC system? ABC systems are very, very expensive to create and to maintain. And that is really the downfall of them. So while there's no real requirement, um, you have to look at it from a cost-benefit point of view. All right. Overcosting, undercosting are always a potential problem, particularly in a peanut butter or plant-wide approach of allocating overhead. And the inherent problem of overcosting is that you assume that something may cost $20 to manufacture when in fact it may only cost 15. So if you're taking a markup on your cost, you're starting from 20 rather than 15. The penalty for the company is that your prices are going to be too high. Competitors that may have a more accurate measure of their cost are going to be able to sell their product at less than you are. You can. Consequently, there will be a loss of sales because if the consumers are indifferent between company A and company B, like you and me, I'd rather pay less than pay more to get the same product. So the penalty of overcosting is a loss of sales. Undercosting is a little bit more. Let's say that the cost should be 20, but you assume that it's 15. Well, okay, if you start with 15, if I'm going to mark it up by 10%, I'm selling at $16.50. And if the cost is really 20, I'm selling at less than cost. So I may be selling more I may be selling more items, but because I'm selling it at less than cost, I'm losing money. So this often creates a dilemma for companies, if you will. Well, why are we, or maybe a sort of paradox, well, why are we selling more but making less? Well, probably you are undercosting your product. And this would be particularly true when you have a very simple product versus a very complex product. Cross-subsidization, we're not going to really worry too much about that. But items that tend to be undercosted, okay, versus overcosted, okay. The ones that are overcosted are picking up some of the cost from the undercosted product. So they are in a sense subsidizing it, okay. But let's not worry too much about this concept. I think if you can remember the issue of overcosting, undercosting, and the penalties that are associated with that, then that's fine for what we need to know with this particular chapter. All right, now we're going to look at an example, looking at a plant-wide approach versus an ABC approach. So this is looking at, again, what we looked at in class, plastin. Again, we are not concerned about this part of the equation. Direct materials and direct labor, we have a very accurate measure of that. The problem is, what do we do with the 2 million? Whoops, oh, boy, went too fast there. Okay, back up here a little bit. Okay, our problem is, what do we do about this 2,385,000 of overhead or indirect cost? And assuming that that's a significant portion of cost, which they generally are, I need to come up with a fairly accurate way of measuring it. Now, in the first case, they're taking a plant-wide approach. They're saying, let's take that 2,385,000 and we'll divide it by 39,750 of direct manufacturing labor hours. So therefore, we will allocate $60 per direct manufacturing labor hour. So again, if the simple requires 1 hour, it would get $60. If the complex requires 2 hours, it would get 120 of indirect cost applied to it. And so, again, the thing that's going to be a little different is simply allocating, taking the 235,000, 2 million, would be allocated a little differently. So these amounts, okay, are going to be identical no matter what method I use. Direct materials, direct labor are not going to change. The indirect costs are going to be based on the number of direct labor hours. And the allocation here is the 1.8 million, okay, times the number of hours that it takes. And assuming that this case, the 60,000 units at 1 hour, so assuming that they're taking 100 hours, okay? And so the issue, don't worry too much about figuring out how many hours that you're worried about here. They're simply giving you the numbers here. You could back into it to figure out what the number of hours are here. But nonetheless, okay, at 30,000, excuse me, at 30,000, um, you allocate these costs. And so I come up with a cost per unit here of both 58.75 for the simple and 97. And that would be using a very kind of simplified plant-wide approach. Now, the problem is that, and what often is a red flag to indicate that maybe you should go to activity-based costing, is this right here, where I have a very complex product versus a very simple product. And remember, overhead is made up of a number of different things. Oops. Okay. And because the complex product may be consuming more of certain costs and less of others, then you may not be getting a good allocation of cost to the respective products. So given that, this company maybe is a very good candidate for activity-based costing. Now, the general rule would be, first of all, what I want to do, whoops, shoot. Okay. My first step in doing activity-based costing is to go back and take a look at that total overhead cost and decide at, with a second review of this, are there any things that I can treat now as a direct cost that I can attribute directly to a particular product rather than have to go through some sort of intermediary? And in this case, they pull out a certain amount of cost, the mold cleaning and maintenance, and say, well, okay, fine, we're going to begin to treat that as a direct cost. Sometimes you may say, well, okay, maybe we can include this as direct materials. Maybe we can include some of these as direct labor. But the more that you can do that, the more accurate your cost is going to be. So the first step is simply to peel off, if you will, whatever layers of that total overhead could now be treated as a direct cost. And it may be that the company is willing to change the way it looked at it from a cost-benefit point of view. They may be willing to incur a little bit more cost than they were before to make that kind of decision. All right. Well, then what you want to do is to create these pools of cost, okay, that tend to act in the same manner. We'll come to this issue here in a little bit when we look at unit level cost, batch level cost, product level cost, and facility level cost, okay? But basically, I want to find pools that sort of act in the same way. I need a manageable number. I can't really work with several hundred or several thousand. That's just unmanageable. And you really don't get any greater degree of accuracy by going to lots of different pools. From a pragmatic point of view, you're going to be more or less given the cost. You may have to identify it as being a unit level, batch, facility, or product level cost. But here's the cost, they just design activity, and fine, here's the activity. Now, sometimes they're active activities, sometimes they're passive activities, such as, in this case, it could be square feet, okay, if I'm allocating janitorial costs. So it's not always something that you're actively doing. It can be sort of a passive thing, too. And so, and part of it, you're not necessarily left to try to figure out, well, what exactly is this? But I would take the 450,000 divided by that and come up with 4,500 per square foot. And do the same with all of these. These become, in a sense, okay, now my new overhead cost application rates, okay, my new normal rate. But rather than one, now I have 6 of them. So the first step in this is to, number one, can I identify any unit costs? Number two, break down the remaining overhead cost into manageable pools. And all of these are going to be either unit level cost. In this one, they might be all batch level cost, okay? The same thing over here. Some of these may be a facility level cost. Some of these may be a product level cost, okay? And that would be one way. I want to make sure that I don't want to put unit level cost in with a facility level cost. And then identify an activity that the company can and does measure, and then come up with these rates here. And then these rates then will be used to determine the cost of a particular item. And so this is really the objective, to come up with these indirect cost rates per now not one activity level, but rather now 6 of them. And again, this is an important consideration over here, the justification for using that activity, that there is some sort of cause and effect relationship here. Because otherwise, I'm doing it more out of convenience than rather out of kind of practical concerns. All right, so the next step is, okay, I have to allocate my cost. So the first iteration would always be to allocate the direct cost that I can attribute directly to that product. Materials, labor, and now again, the mold, cleaning, and maintenance cost. Don't worry so much in these columns right here, these unit level costs. You'll come back to these a little bit later. The first step is to go through and allocate total overhead per each activity. So given that the simple requires 30 parts and the complex requires 70 parts, take the 30 times 4,500 to 70 times 4,500, and you get 135 and 315,000 total. Again, don't worry about the unit level cost. Go through and do the same thing with the mold setup, okay? Again, these are batch level costs. They had 500 setup hours, so take that times $150. They have 1,500 setup hours under the complex, okay? And notice what's happening. The whole point of activity-based costing is this right here. You can see this between these two, that each product is consuming an element of overhead differently. That, for example, the design, well, you would say, well, yeah, it would be natural that a complex product would be taking more design cost than a simple setup. Probably to set up for a more complex product would require more setup time. So a lot of these are just sort of common sense too. As part of the other rationale, well, why do I need to go to a, if you will, activity-based costing? Now, paradoxically, machine operations, they're using 9,000, excuse me, machine molding hours versus 3,750 for the complex. So again, this one is consuming a lot more of that particular element of overhead. And you just keep going through and you apply the overhead, and you come down to these kind of facility level costs. And these are the ones you really kind of hold your nose and say, well, okay, maybe we'll do it in labor. We really don't have anything else to do. When you come down, this is kind of your last gasp. If I can't put overhead into any other category, I make it a facility level cost. And then I find some convenient way, often labor hours or labor dollars is a way of doing that, and I allocate the cost. So I come down and I say, okay, look, here are all of my total cost here of $2,999,953. If I divide that by 60,000, here is my unit level cost, $49.98. Do the same thing over here. Sum up all the total cost here of $1,981,47 divided by 15,000, and I end up with that cost per unit. Now, again, if you want to add these up, that's fine, but really the relevant number here is the cost, total cost per unit. All right, we'll move back up here. Generally speaking, what will end up happening as you move to activity-based costing, not all the time, but often, that a simple product's total cost will tend to decrease, the complex product will tend to increase when you move from kind of the peanut butter approach to activity-based costing. And that's really what you found here, that in fact that you were overcosting the simple, undercosting the complex, and again, that has the inherent problems that we talked about. So all these general ideas I think we talked about, you can read through those, the last few PowerPoint slides I've kind of jumped through here real quick. But those kind of get at, okay, how, why, when, and I should do this, okay? And again, these are the things that how, when, and why. It's difficult, it's complex. You have to get everybody to buy into why I'm doing this, the importance of it, and particularly in a very competitive environment, knowing precisely what your costs are is really crucial to maintain whatever the required profit margins are for that particular company. Activity-based management, as I talked about, If you want to reduce cost, you don't attack the cost, you attack the activity. And so if I want to reduce some of my cost, then the idea is that, okay, let's reduce some, let's say, look at setup cost, okay, batch level cost. Well, I don't just kind of take a line and say, okay, we're going to reduce total batch level cost from 500,000 down to 450,000. That doesn't really work. The question would be, well, is there some way that we can manufacture the same quantity, the same quality of product using less setup hours and attack the activity? That will in turn, because the assumption is the activity causes a cost. If you want to reduce a cost, you have to reduce the cause of the cost. Let's attack the activity. So you may say, we're going to reduce hours by setup hours by 3%. This year, that's a realistic goal. That should bring down the cost. Again, ABC can be used not only in manufacturing, but it can be used in any number of business situations. All right, so that concludes the little lecture on activity-based costing. If you have any questions, please give me a call or stop by, and I'll be glad to talk about any questions you might have with respect to activity-based costing.